All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope everyone is able to log on, and we thank you for taking some time today to join us over your lunch. By means of introduction, my name is Ashley Putnam, and I direct the Economic Growth and Mobility Project here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And I'm so excited about today's session and a topic that is something we've done a little bit of work on here in Philadelphia and the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. And something that we've been really interested in as it impacts economic opportunity for all of our regions. So thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is on COVID-19 and whether or not it accelerates automation. This webinar is the 5th series in a session that we've been doing called Research for Equity and Recovery. And these series are hosted in conjunction with Penn, IUR, and the Upjohn Institute. So we thank you to those of you who have joined us in previous series, and we think today's conversation is going to be really informative and important as we think about what's happening with COVID-19 and our recovery, and how do we make sure that that recovery is more equitable. I also did want to start with our standard disclaimer. So just so you know, today the information, analysis, and conclusions set forth are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. Now, a couple really quick logistical items before we transition over to meet our fantastic set of panelists today. First, you need to know that the webinar today is being recorded. The recording and presentations will be posted online afterwards. So if you are not able to stay for the whole webinar or just joining us a little bit late, we will have that available so that you can see all of the presentations and listen to the information. Please know that all participants are muted. But if you do have a question, we encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A box. And you'll see that there at the bottom of your screen. So you can use that at any time during the discussion. And we will be having some moderated Q&A at the end of the session. And so again, on behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and this really exciting conversation. And let me just take a quick second and introduce the other folks who will be with us. So I'm really pleased today to have David Autor, who's a professor at MIT. Many of you listening have probably read quite a bit of his work and scholarship. He is one of the foremost scholars on automation and is very excited to be discussing some new research he's been doing. We also have my colleague Lei Ding, who is a senior economic advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And my other colleague, Ann Gemmell, who we worked with last year in our Future of Work in Philadelphia project, which was part of our Research and Action Lab that the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia conducted here. And so Ann will be updating you both from her perspectives from her previous work at the City of Philadelphia, but also as the founder of the Future Work Strategy. She's excited to talk about that. And then a special introduction today for our moderator, Susan Wachter. She's the co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research and has just been a fantastic partner to us in this series on research for equity and recovery. And so I'm excited this morning to turn it over to our moderator today, Susan. Thank you so much, Susan.
Series with the Upjohn Institute and the Fed. Research and equity in recovery is important. There's nothing more important as we face the challenges of recovery and the ongoing challenges of inequity. And it is particularly good to have you, Ashley Putnam, with us today. As Ashley heads up, she's the director of the Economic Growth and Mobility Project at the Philadelphia Fed, and she will be able to answer questions. She will stay with us to the question and answer portion of today's webinar. We have a wonderful panel today, including, as you've heard, David Autor, who is a professor at MIT and who heads up co-heads the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. And also we have Lei Ding, who is a senior economic advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and Ann Gemmell, who is the founder of Future Work Strategy. We will turn to each panelist in a moment, who will have 10 minutes approximately to speak, and then we will have time for questions and answers. As Ashley mentioned, you can, and please do, type in your questions at any point in the Q&A box. Please submit them so that we can have a robust conversation after the panelists do their presentations. And so with that, we will start with our first presenter, David Autor. David?
Great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be speaking briefly about a recent, just short article, speculative article that I wrote for Brookings, the Hamilton Project, with Elizabeth Reynolds, who's one of the co-leaders of the MIT Work of the Future Task Force. And our article is called "The Nature of Work After the COVID Crisis: Too Few Low-Wage Jobs." I'll explain what I mean by that. So we focus on 4 effects that we think are likely going to follow from the COVID crisis and will be with us after the crisis has ended. The first of these is telepresence. What I mean by telepresence, of course, is just doing things remotely. And I think it's easy to overlook, but natural once you think about it, to realize that telepresence is a form of automation. The idea of being in a place without having to go there is a form of automation because it saves you. You've automated your transport and all the services that get you there. This term was first thoughtfully applied in this way by David Mindell, who's also one of my colleagues on the Work of the Future Task Force. And he was a pioneer in deep sea exploration. Deep sea exploration prior to David's work was all done by putting people in highly reinforced submarines that would go deep into the sea to look around and pick things up. David helped develop telepresently controlled exploration vehicles, and that turns out to have many advantages. It's safer, it's cheaper, it's faster, you can go deeper, and you don't expose people to the hazards of all that travel to the bottom of the sea. Well, we are seeing something similar now in the type of work we do. There's an increase primarily among the top quartile of higher educated workers in doing their work remotely. That could refer to either to both office work or to business travel. And so why is that important? Well, it's obviously important to us. It changes what we do, but that's not my focus here. The reason I think it's particularly important for the labor market is it's going to change demand for many of the low-paid services that support the type of physical commuting that we currently do. So, great. So, as many will be well aware, the U.S. economy and many advanced economies have experienced a sort of a barbell of employment growth, where a lot of the growth has been, on the one hand, in high-paid professional, technical, and managerial work, and the other in a lot of physical in-person services. So in 2018, before the COVID crisis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics projected that between 2018 and 2028, the U.S. would add about 8.4 million jobs. 4.6 million of them would be in just 20 occupations. And those occupations are concentrated in health aides, food and cleaning services, labor occupations, landscaping. These are mostly jobs that do not require a college or even post-high school degree. They pay below the median wage. They're economically insecure, and they don't have much of a career trajectory. People don't tend to have rising wages over the life cycle in that work. So we've had a lot of growth in those, and the pandemic seems likely, and here's a picture that shows you that, to slow or reverse that, because if you don't go to the office, you won't be stopping for coffee along the way or for gas. You won't necessarily be going out to lunch. You will not need security and building services. You will not, or cleaning services. And so a lot of the consumption and work decisions of highly paid professionals affect the job opportunities of the less well-paid workers who attend to their care and comfort and convenience. And so this change will affect that type of work. If we've had a kind of a barbell labor market, then one end of the bar, maybe one end of the weights may be sliding off the bar. And you might say, well, isn't that good news? After all, these are low-paid jobs. Isn't it great that we have fewer of them? And the answer to that is no, that's not good news. You don't create opportunity by eliminating one set of jobs. We would like to have more jobs in the middle, in production, office, administrative, and sales jobs, but eliminating low-wage jobs doesn't create other jobs. The second related phenomenon that we think is likely to occur is what we're going to call de-densification. This figure shows you the growth of employment among non-college workers in 3 occupation categories. One are these low-paid services, transport, and labor positions I was speaking of. The second are mid-pay production, clerical, administrative support occupations. And the third are high-paid professional, technical, and managerial occupations. The x-axis, the bottom part of each of these figures, is population density. So on the left-hand side, you have rural areas, then suburbs, then metro areas, then cities. And the y-axis is the employment share. What you can see, if you look in the middle figure, the middle panel, among non-college workers, there used to be a very steep gradient. So as you move from rural areas to suburban areas to metro areas to cities, non-college workers were increasingly found in these middle pay production, clerical, admin, and sales jobs, and they did comparatively fewer of those low paid services on the left-hand side. Over the last 4 decades, if you follow in the middle panel downward, 1980 in blue, 1990 in red, 2000 in green, 2007 in yellow, and 2015 in kind of teal, what you see is all those middle skill jobs have kind of disappeared. They're no longer more prevalent in cities. Instead, people are working in these personal services. So if the COVID crisis has the effect of reducing the degree to which people need to commute to urban downtowns, and even more so, reducing business travel, so people are not showing up in New York and London and Hong Kong and and Taipei and so on for business meetings, it's going to reduce the demand for this urban service work. Now, again, these are low-paid jobs. Their pay has not even kept up with the cost of living in cities. So I'm not romanticizing them, but the reduction in opportunity in those activities will create hardship for the workers who are concentrating in those areas, particularly minority workers who are hugely overrepresented in cities and hugely overrepresented in this set of services. So cumulatively, these first two effects, telepresence and dedensification, I think are going to place downward pressure on the low-paid US labor market. And that labor market at least had been experiencing wage growth in the tight working conditions prior to the COVID crisis. Okay, let me move quickly on to the third point, which is firm concentration. So a well-documented fact is that in the United States and in other countries, many other high-income countries, although this is debated to what extent, but certainly in the United States, there's been a fall in labor share of national income. So in other words, when firms receive sales, they can pay that in addition to covering their cost of materials. They can pay that to labor. They can pay that to owners of capital, buildings, and machines. They can pay that to shareholders and owners. In the US, the share paid to labor, to workers, has fallen by about 5 to 7 percentage points since 2000. It's a historic fall. Now, why is that a problem? It's not a loss of income per se, it's just a redistribution of income from labor to capital, to owners of businesses. But recall that ownership of capital is far more concentrated than ownership of labor. In the best case, in a society without slavery and indentured servitude, everyone owns at most one labor, their own. But the ownership of capital is highly concentrated. A small number of people own a very large share of all the capital wealth, and most people don't even own stock. So this reallocation, this fall in labor share, this movement increases inequality. Well, that phenomenon is likely to accelerate as a result of the COVID crisis, because this fall in labor share is associated with the growth of large firms. When Walmart grows at the expense of mom and pop shops, when Amazon grows at the expense of many small retailers, that has the effect of moving economic activity to large firms and depressing labor share. We expect that many of these small firms are just not going to make it through the valley of death that we're currently in. They do not have the savings, they do not have the access to capital markets, they do not have the business models that can adjust successfully to this very, very demanding and difficult set of changes that we are in right now. And so when we come out of this crisis, we expect that larger firms will be an even larger share of the US economy. And as a consequence, labor share of national income will be depressed further. That brings me to the final point, which is automation forcing. And this will complement nicely, I think, what Leigh is going to be speaking of next. And you hear much discussion of has the COVID crisis caused firms to automate things they wouldn't have otherwise automated. And I don't think we can give, at least I cannot give, Leigh probably can, representative evidence on this question, but you can see many examples around you of drones delivering medical supplies, of warehouse disinfecting robots, of temperature checking drones, of labor saving reorganization within firms, all responding to the fact that workers became unavailable, that it became dangerous to expose them to disease, and yet demand persisted in many activities in warehousing, transportation, health services, and so on. A really good example of this is meatpacking. So as many of you know, workers in meatpacking have been very adversely affected by the COVID crisis. More than 200 of them have died in the United States. And this creates a very strong incentive for firms to automate, to use machines rather than labor. But of course, firms have known that for a long time and they haven't done it. Why have they not done it? Well, meatpacking is a really tough assignment for robots. Robots are really at their best in situations where the things they deal with are consistent and predictable, putting windshields on cars, welding the same weld over and over again 1,000 times a day. But when you're dealing with meat packing, you're dealing with animal carcasses, which are soft and inconsistent and highly variable, each one separately. So it requires a lot of dexterity, flexibility, touch and sight and feel to cut a carcass efficiently. And if you don't do it well, one of two things can happen. If you cut too conservatively, of course, a lot of meat gets wasted. If you cut too aggressively, bone ends up in the meat. Neither one of those things is something that a meat packing firm wants to have happen. And that's why robotics has moved slowly into meat packing. But it's moving much faster now. And it's moving much faster because of necessity. And so it's not that this never would have occurred. It's that the shortage of labor, the danger of disease, and the availability of technology that was kind of on the shelf but had not been exploited kind of pulls innovation from the future into the present. These things will happen, maybe 5 or 10 years faster than they otherwise would have occurred. And so I do think we'll see accelerated automation. And even when we come out of this crisis, even when labor is going to be cheap again, because there will be high unemployment and many people seeking work, firms will not necessarily roll back these innovations. Once a meatpacking firm has gone to robotics, unless it's unsuccessful, it's unlikely they will say, oh, let's just put the robots on the shelves now and go back to workers. These are kind of one-way transitions. And so I think the net effect is that we have many technologies that were kind of waiting to be made to be commercialized, having to do with AI, having to do with drones, having to do with robotics. There's just a whole toolkit on the shelf that people are only beginning to realize its capacities, and those capacities will be recognized and commercialized and implemented faster than would otherwise have occurred. So let me just conclude. There were, I think, 4 effects, whoops, not on my slide, that I think appear to likely be persistent. One is this rise in telepresence. I think many of us will be doing Zoom meetings and less business travel for a long time to come, even in the way we teach. That has pluses and minuses, but will change demand for services. Similarly, this will reduce the centrality of cities, both for services and also potentially for the way that we do knowledge work. If so, that will again spill over to demand for many of these low-paid service jobs. Sales and value added will be further reallocated towards large firms. We've already seen that, of course, with many of the online firms, but I think it will be true in retail, it will be true in restaurants, and so on. The slack labor market coming out of the pandemic is likely to dramatically reduce the wage pressure in low-paid services. And the one good thing you could say about these many low-paid service jobs that were growing so rapidly is they weren't great jobs, but there were a lot of them. And there being a lot of them meant they were working more aggressively to attract workers. And now they will not have to work as aggressively, which means wages will grow more slowly. And that's not a good thing. One wild card I'll leave you with, I think this is one I've seen nothing on, but is worth thinking about, is it seems plausible to me that many workers who are late in their careers, who've left their labor market temporarily because of the COVID crisis, may decide not to return. Either because conditions are unfavorable or because they've adjusted to a new lifestyle or a variety of things. And if so, that will also change the labor market, because we know that when people retire, it actually creates opportunity for younger workers. And this is not just the case that when academics retire, it frees up a tenure slot. It's also the case that we know from kind of unintended policy experiments in Austria, that when older workers retire, younger workers immediately face renewed employment and wage prospects. So this change in labor supply could be consequential, and it's not part of the sort of standard story of the demand side that I focused on here. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to questions, and I look very much forward to the other presentations ahead. Thanks very much.
Susan, you are muted.
Thank you, David, for that comprehensive view of the workforce challenges ahead. And we now turn to Lei Ding, who is Senior Research Advisor at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, and who has new research that was just released this week on the impact of COVID on automation. Lei?
Yeah, let me get control of the screen. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, David, I think, for the great presentation. And it seems, I think, that's a very good, I think, this prediction of what would happen in the post-pandemic world. We will switch the gear a little bit. I think since our research focuses on the short-term effects of automation during the pandemic. As Susan just mentioned, it's just based on a report I released early this week. It's a joint work with Julius Caesar Molina. And here's the standard disclaimer, my views only, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. As David just mentioned, I think there have been lots of anecdotal evidence of accelerated automation, and I just want to give you a few more examples. And the first one is, I think in June 2020, Pennsylvania laid off 500 toll collectors after the interstate system temporarily went cashless in response to COVID-19 in March. And also similar examples can be found in meatpacking factories and also in hotels where human workers were replaced by self-checking kiosk, and also in companies where call center jobs were replaced by conversational AI platforms, and also I think in construction and other industries as well in retail. For this one, for this empirical piece, I think based on the most recent current population survey data, I just want to give you a preview of the results. First of all, I think we found the pandemic likely accelerated automation by leading more job losses in technically automatable occupations that expose them at an elevated risk of being permanently automated. The second finding, I think, is the pandemic put automatable jobs held by minority workers at a high risk of permanent losses. The third one, while I think many of the job losses were expected to be temporary, losses could become permanent, as I think what happened during the recovery from the previous recessions. Finally, forced automation could create huge demand for government interventions to support those jobless and massive job reallocation ahead of us. We contend that there are at least three primary channels for the accelerated automation in the short term and also during the pandemic. First of all, I think the pandemic led to, as we will show a little bit later, led to more job losses in automatable occupations. And even I think when the economy started to recover, machines and software may still become more attractive than rehiring displaced workers, especially now. I think we are still in the pandemic. The example I gave you early, I think the toll collectors fits, I think, this category perfectly. Second, I think even in some sectors, there is an increased demand. The constraint labor supply still encourage firms to use technology to substitute for workers. And even the pandemic is over, if the firms are satisfied with this labor-saving technology, and these jobs could be automated permanently as well. A third, I think, is the recession usually reduces the adjustment cost associated with the automation that leads to more automation across sectors, not necessarily in the sectors that were hit harder by the crisis. That's all these, I think, happened in the past and it's undergoing as well. But the pandemic just forced more firms and businesses to conduct large-scale experiments with new technologies, new worker arrangements, and this kind of forced automation could become permanent in the long run as well. Of course, I think in the long run, there were other, I think, structural changes, as David just mentioned, that will induce more automation. First question I think we try to address in our empirical work is whether automatable occupations were hit harder by COVID-19. The answer is yes. The pandemic has led significantly larger job losses in technically automatable occupations. We compared the monthly employment to their pre-crisis level in January 2020. By August, automatable occupations lost 4.2 more jobs per 100 than low-risk ones. That's equivalent to about 2.6 million pre-crisis jobs. Here, I think the technically automatable jobs identified based on the well-known Free and Osmond study, and that's primarily those occupations were identified by a group of AI and machine learning experts in early 2010s as those that can be replaced by demonstrated technologies in the next 1 or 2 decades. Some examples of these kind of automatable jobs are like hotel desk clerks, shuttle drivers, retail sales representatives, parking attendants. I think most of them, I think, as you can imagine, were hit harder by the crisis. And also across different sectors, you can see almost, I think, about 10 out of these 11 sectors I listed here. And they experienced larger losses in automatable job occupations than in low-risk occupations, especially in those leisure and hospitality, transportation, information, manufacturing, retail, and others. And so why I think there have been larger losses in automatable jobs, we found that those jobs, I think, with a high risk of virus transmission and those jobs that does not allow remote work were hit harder by the pandemic. And also automatable jobs on average are more vulnerable to the pandemic as well because they are generally less likely to permit remote work. They are more likely to be in the most affected sectors, especially the service sector. So that leads, I think, larger losses in the more automatable occupations. Now, I think let's look at the experience of different subpopulations, especially the vulnerable workers. The pattern is quite obvious. And as you learn, I think, from maybe other research and the news articles, that workers who are already very vulnerable in the job market, such as minority workers, younger workers those under 25 years, and also the female workers and less educated workers, those without a bachelor degree, experience larger job losses when the pandemic first hit. And generally, they have not fully recovered, and they still experience larger job losses as of August. But we do notice that younger workers, those I think younger than 25, were hit extremely hard at the beginning of the crisis, but they recovered very quickly. But even as of August, their unemployment was still more than doubled of that last year. Among different subpopulation, we compared the job loss within for the automatable occupations versus, I think, those low-risk occupations. We found the pandemic put more minorities at an elevated risk of automation. As we found that minority workers generally lost 7 more jobs in automatable occupations, but among non-Hispanic whites, those holding automatable jobs only lost about 1.9 more jobs per 100. So that's, I think, why we are saying that the pandemic has put more jobs held by minority workers at high risk of permanent job loss. But for other vulnerable workers, the pattern is still unclear. Yeah, and when we replicated the same analysis for the Great Recession, we found, first of all, I think almost all job losses in automatable occupations during the Great Recession became permanent during the recovery. Also, I think there was, of course, I think there are some differences between the current COVID-19 crisis and also the Great Recession. For example, it's a health crisis, and the previous one was financial crisis. And also there are some differences in the composition of impacted sectors and occupations. And also there are some other differences in terms of the duration of the crisis. But we are just arguing that the loss of automatable jobs could become permanent if it evolves into a prolonged economic crisis. And as you can see, as by March, about 5 months into the recovery, there was still a significant gap between the job loss rates for automatable occupations and also the less automatable occupations. But here, I think we focus on the short-term effects only. In the long term, I think we still need to wait and see what's going on. Finally, I just want to give you a quick summary of, again, I think what we found in this report. We found, I think, the pandemic likely accelerated automation, and by leading more job losses. We are arguing that those jobs that have been lost during the crisis, and also those jobs, and at the same time, they are technically automatable. So these jobs, I think, are at even higher risk than many others. And also, I think some groups like minority workers are at even higher risk, and also some of the job losses could become permanent. And all these, I think, have important policy implications for the government to help the jobless and also for the job reallocation after the pandemic. Finally, I think if you want to learn more about these findings, you can, I think, download our paper from our website. Thank you. Just to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Lei. Thank you for this research that is so relevant and so recent, and that confirms David's long-term contributions in this area in today's presentation on the persistence of the automation trends. And they're happening right now, as you point out with your new data, a loss of almost 3 million jobs, even just recently. We need solutions, and so let us turn to Ann Gemmell, and is heads up the new Future Works strategy group and is focusing on solutions. Ann, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Does anyone feel right now like this man pictured? That's exactly how I felt when I first started understanding exactly how the coming advances in technology would impact people. I felt like this. But now, a few years later, I feel more hopeful, and I'm working to mitigate future shocks and build systems of opportunity for a more inclusive future economy. Thank you to the Federal Reserve Bank and David and Lee for the great research. The Fed particularly has truly led in this area and catalyzed practitioners. So I wanted to thank them for having me. Before we get started on future proofing, we need to recognize that a few realities. First, I'm going to be examining what other countries have done, but we need to understand that the United States is different in a lot of ways. First and foremost, maybe not different in other countries, but most large institutions are not naturally innovative, and they could really use some help understanding emerging technology. The second reality is that public trust in institutions is eroding. And third, despite their best intentions, local government is really busy with a triple black swan event: pandemic, economic crisis, and a long overdue racial reckoning. Fourth, prediction is becoming impossible. Think about the iPhone. It is only 12 years old. Twitter is 13 years old. Few could have predicted their impact. Hurricanes are far easier now to predict and prepare for than emerging technology. There are so many variables in play, as we saw in the previous presentations. So scenario planning for challenges will not come from a single mayor or a group of CEOs or a single person in a presentation at a podium. And if we hold hierarchy dear, it will really slow our preparation. In 2019, in recognition of this reality, along with my colleagues at the Office of Workforce Development, I convened over 100 experts, and we dove into an adaptation of a global index called the Automation Readiness Index that looked at different strategies and policies that other countries were implementing to get themselves ready for automation. We want to be able to thrive even as smart robots start flipping hamburgers. And that was our goal, to really take an honest assessment of how ready our region was. And since then, I've refined the approach and the assessment into 4 future-proofing pillars, each pillar identifying opportunities and challenges that require groundbreaking levels of collaboration across silos. First and foremost, we need well-informed shared consensus and inclusive, transparent civic dialogue that connects community and experts across sectors. Let's start with the pillars. The first pillar is centered on innovation. Innovation means that we're well positioned to capture the opportunities and promises behind automation and AI. As David indicated, it's not good that low-wage jobs are getting eliminated, but they are, very many of them, dirty, dull, and dangerous, and they're not good jobs. So how do we position and embrace new technology so that the careers of the future land in our metro area, not just in Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, Silicon Valley? The top innovation questions that we should be asking ourselves and working together to find solutions for are as such. First, how can we pull down more science and technology research and development funding into our region and transition it into the marketplace as breakthroughs become businesses? We need to create a business environment that is easy for businesses to grow and easy for talent to match up to those businesses. Second, what is the regional economic development plan? And is it aligned with an AI-powered future? Is the plan racially equitable? Can we easily revisit this plan and adjust when we're not in crisis mode? Workforce planning and talent development systems nest inside economic development plans. You cannot have the former do well without the latter. Lastly, other countries have done this and we can do it too, creating a citizens' digital strategy around digital divide, surveillance, data governance, data privacy issues. How can we sustain the progress that's been made during the pandemic? Kudos to the city, kudos to Comcast and foundations for starting to address the digital divide, but that was great crisis management. What is the progress that we need to make beyond that? Because everyone needs internet to access the modern economy, just like we need plumbing and water to access hygiene. The next pillar is education. How can every child start kindergarten ready to learn? How can uniquely human skills like creativity and curiosity and empathy, as well as technology skills, be core to a K-12 curriculum? We need a culture shift in education that recognizes and internalizes that learning never ends. Lastly, how will our schools adapt as technology untethers credentials from skills? As knowledge moves around like air at hurricane speeds, how will schools adapt when anyone can get skills regardless of the credentials? The next pillar is the area of land use. The way that we use the physical space is important and affected by technology. What will happen to commercial corridors as Amazon delivers by drone? How can we construct our parks and towns in ways to support health and mental resilience for people that are going to be dealing with constant churn in their careers and their jobs and the labor market at large? How can service workers, to David's point, access and travel to jobs if knowledge workers who hire them are dispersed across the region? Last pillar, but certainly not least, is the talent system. There it is, the talent system. It was a little slow. Every company, backing up to the talent pillar, there we go. Every company is now a tech company, or they will not be around for long as AI and automation go deeper into the economy. Let's build the tech talent system through business-led private industry partnerships and proven training programs so that we have the talent we need. Look at cybersecurity, for example. It's become a national shortage risk. There's so much shortage in the talent. Secondly, the care economy is very future-proof. We have to create workforce systems that make it easy for a Macy's retail worker to become a healthcare worker in one of our major sectors. How can we link small and medium-sized businesses with community colleges so that we can replicate Drexel's successful model of co-op that exposes kids to careers, students, college kids to careers, and also keeps curriculum fresh? There are so many promising future-proofing strategies underway in each area, but they need to work together and collaborate, communicate, co-design, and combine forces. The brain power in the region is world-class. We have a choice. We do things the same way we've always done them, or we change and do things differently. On the left, I chose a photo from recent civil unrest. If we do nothing, we know that the costs of inaction are very steep. If we do nothing to ensure authentic opportunities so that more people can realize their full potential, we will see more poverty, more disease of despair, more violence, and yes, more social and civil unrest for the coming decade. It's really on us. No single elected leader can lead this. The challenges ahead will require intentional collaboration like we've never seen before, pulling people in from up and down the socioeconomic ladder. Right now, I am building something I'm very excited about called the Future Works Alliance. It was a project started along with the Fed and many others inside of city government, but it was stalled by the pandemic. The Future Works Alliance is an adaptation of efforts successfully built in other countries that are now more prepared for automation and AI. Countries like Germany, Japan, Canada have collaborative tables. Here, it could be a regional, equitable, and shared civic dialogue to transparently develop and help sustain regional future-proofing strategies. The Future Works Alliance will be outside of politics, but welcoming to government. We need a bridge to our collective future. Committed founders are already in place for the Future Works Alliance. They are leaders, planners, tech experts, entrepreneurs, researchers, more. A full announcement is coming in weeks. But just imagine for a minute, more businesses using the most equitable and cutting edge talent and HR practices. Imagine every major employer in our region actively working with education and training programs to increase their quality and source talent. Imagine how research can turn to action like we've seen today to help people future-proof their careers before they are unemployed and in financial crisis. Imagine philanthropy honors the wisdom of community and takes risks on innovation pilots and solutions. This is what I envision, and I really appreciate the chance to share it with you today. If you would like to join this effort or learn more about the Future Works Alliance, I would encourage you to feel free and contact me through LinkedIn. I'll put it in the chat. And I want to thank the other presenters and the Fed for pulling this together. I really look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for your work in heading up this effort. I'm going to start the Q&A with some questions for the panelists, including question for Ashley about the work that the Fed is doing. Let me start with you, David. So you pointed to the information that showed a barbell economy with the greatest increase in jobs on the both ends of the barbell, low-paid workers and managerial workers. Net going forward, after we come out of the pandemic, do you see all of these forces coming together that you have detailed will in fact lower the demand for low-skilled, low-paid workers? And can you give us a sense of what the magnitude of the change in what we saw in the decades prior to the pandemic?
Sure. So I'm not very good at forecasting. So I'm not going to give a number, unfortunately, but I will say, yeah, I do think there'll be a decline in demand for many of those personal services, because I think there'll just be less demand for office cleaning, less demand for hotels and transportation, less demand for security. I think people will continue to consume other services, including, I don't predict any decline in people going out to eat, but some of those will move to new locations. Move to the suburbs, move where people are, both working and living as opposed to where they're commuting. There'll also be growth in new activities. I mean, one thing, that I think has been remarked often in the newspaper is there's been as high-income consumers have been stuck at home and not traveling and not going to work, they've been spending their monies differently. If you are a purveyor of hot tubs or personal watercraft or high-end office remodeling and so on for homes, that has been those businesses have been going very strong during the pandemic. So I think that high-income consumers will continue to consume, but they will change the location of where they consume and the type of expenditures that they're making. So I do think, and again, the adjustment falls much more on the workers who provide those services than the individuals who are demanding them. I don't know if that's a complete answer to the question.
Yes, that's great. That's great. That's exactly what I was hoping that you would point to, which is that we don't know the total impact on low-paid workers. We know it's likely to be negative since this is automation's impact, but that there also will be increase for other jobs. Let me turn to you, Lei, and can you, from your very recent data, buttress this question of, yes, automation is hitting low-paid workers. Can you extract sort of the main message from what you've seen that points to that result?
Yeah. What we found, of course, I think I have to admit that we cannot observe, I think, extra automation. What we found is for those, I think, more automatable occupations, they experienced larger job losses during the pandemic. So that will make the extra automation more likely. Just think about that during the normal times, during economic boom, those businesses are in good shape. They change their business and to lay off people. It's also very hard, I think, to lay off people, right? Just think about the toll collector example I gave. And in normal time, I think it might take years, I think, to accomplish this. But because of the pandemic, they already temporarily laid off, and it's much easier for the firm, I think, to take the action. So that's why we are seeing that it speed up, I think, the speed of the automation. It makes, I think, the possibility becomes reality, I think, in some cases, and it may change, I think, the firm's behavior during the pandemic.
So you, Lei, and you, David, and then I'm going to turn to you, Anne, for hopefully for answers, although I know it's the beginning of your work on this. But both of you, David and Lei, have pointed to forced automation as a important determinant of loss of jobs, low-paid, low-skilled jobs. Can you respond to Lei, and then we'll turn to you, David? Forced automation, jobs lost, are those permanent job losses? Do we know?
Actually, we don't know. And although I think we observed large job losses in these automatable occupations, I would say there are other factors, I think, there as well. For example, we cannot separate demand shock, just like those job losses for waiters and waitresses, barbers. Many of them, I think, I would expect this would be able to come back when the economy, I think, starts to recover. But we suspect, I think, for many others, just like the examples I give you, I think, for the hotel workers and meat, I think, packing factories workers, and many others, I think, they may not come back. So that's our concern. And also, I think, as David just mentioned, there might be a shift in the demand in the future, and that will cause, I think, the change out these, I think, permanent job losses for these in these occupations, not necessarily automated, just disappeared. Probably that will also happen as well.
So, David, give us the economist's perspective on this. Hotel desk jobs now are disappearing because hotels, of course, themselves are in no demand, but also when they are, workers are exposed to the pandemic, and so therefore things are being automated. But people like to see people. So do we see these jobs coming back, or once automated, always automated?
Some of them will definitely come back if hotels come back, if people are using them. in-person service is a luxury good, and when you go up the the kind of status chain, especially in travel, hotel or airlines, as where you see it the most, what you get is more people, right? So if you're flying business class, not only are you getting a larger seat, but you're getting a person who's sort of attending to your care and comfort. When you go to a high-end hotel, you have lots of people who ask you, where are you going? Would you like your room made up? Can I help you? And if you go to a low-end hotel, you don't. And so people are expensive. If you call an airline, if you have a lot of frequent flyer miles, you'll get right through to a person. If you don't, you'll be spending a lot of time fighting with the computer to get through to a person. So I don't think personal service is over, and I don't think people think that automated service is better than personal service for many, many things. But on the other hand, automation offers as it offers a cheaper way to do it, you're effectively paying more to get that. And whether you will or not depends on the where you are on that trade-off. So we certainly see fewer people at Home Depot, fewer people at Costco, fewer people at the checkout counter at many stores than you would have historically. But if you go to a high-end clothing store or high-end furniture store, you will be mobbed by salespeople.
Okay, so no end for personal services, but certainly changes, which poses a dilemma, it seems to me. And if you can help us with this, Anne, how do you think about training people for future jobs when you don't know what the future jobs will look like?
Well, as we've seen in other countries, they're not trying to predict what the jobs are going to be, but there is agreement across industries of what skills will become more valuable. So the problem-solving skills, to David's point, you're not going to put an employee in front of a high-end client that can't solve that client's problem. And so problem-solving skills are the most important. The empathy skills, the creativity, the curiosity, being able to read the emotional temperature of a client. So those skills are missing from our K-12 system. They are not internalized into the curriculum. We are still stuck in foundational mode, which is very important that everyone read and write. But we need to evolve both our K-12 and education systems and workforce development systems. So, since 2017, the city and other workforce development agencies have been working together to embed the people skills and the technology skills, which are both so core to future jobs, regardless of where you are, into existing development training curriculum.
Thank you, Anne. I am now going to turn to the questions from the audience, and thank you, audience, for so many good questions. Anne, I'd like you to weigh on this question again as well. But David, I'd like you to, given your work on education, what do you see as the quote-unquote happy path for individuals in low-skilled jobs to move towards higher wage and higher skilled jobs, for example, in tech? David, do you have a happy path that we can think going forward on this, that today's low-skilled workers can go on?
I think there are a number of paths that are happier than others, including there are certainly STEM type jobs that don't require college degrees. There are jobs in health paraprofessions which offer some of the best and some of the worst jobs for people without college degrees. And so I don't want to say that there are no opportunities, but I do think we need to recognize that changing people is a lot slower than changing jobs. And the notion that we can just rebuild people to match whatever economic conditions are prevalent at any given moment, and that's our solution, that's just not enough. And we should be thinking harder about job quality. We don't have a job quantity problem, or at least we didn't until recently. And I don't think we'll have one again 5 years from now, but we will have a job quality problem. And with that, that's a choice that we make. Other countries have the same types of jobs, and yet working conditions are not as poor. And yes, prices are higher, but I would rather live in a country with everyday good jobs than in a country with everyday low prices. So that's a trade-off we can make, and that it means ensuring some degree of economic security, even in jobs that we make relatively precarious in the United States. So of course, I would have to hand back in my PhD if I didn't say we should invest in skills and human capital. But I think we should stop kidding ourselves that itself is sufficient or fast acting enough to deal with the challenges that we face.
So I have a follow-on question for you, David. but I want to turn to Anne as well, and that is, so you could combine these questions. What do you see as the future of higher education? Traditionally brick and mortar centers for learning. So if you could address both these questions, Anne, and then back to you, David, on the future of brick and mortar higher education.
Well, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on the happy path.
Yes, please.
There is an issue around quality versus quantity of jobs that we have control over that as policymakers. And in fact, it begins with measuring how many quality jobs do we have in our economy. We don't even measure that right now. Like we don't have a clear consensus-driven definition of what is a quality job. That's a first step, like measure what matters. Secondly, we need to recognize there's going to be anger, and that is a part of the cost of doing nothing and not collaborating differently. There's not just happy paths. There are going to be a lot of people that are not able to pivot into new roles. So we need to both shore up the escalators that go into future-proof careers, and there's good research out of the Federal Reserve in Cleveland around transferable skills, but there's a dose of realism that needs to happen here. And it's also on top of the gig economy and the growth of independent contractors. We have no safety net that's untethered to employment that is sufficient to meet the demands of the future churn. People are going to be switching jobs. They're going to have phases of unemployment and independent contracting. What happens to their health insurance? What happens to their disability or sick time? So we don't have answers for that, but other countries are developing this, and we need to start building consensus locally so that we can advocate and lean into a national dialogue effectively. As far as brick and mortar education, as I said in the chat, in the presentation, I think that this area, education disruption, could very well produce the next Amazon. There is so much that needs to happen in education. And this pandemic is showing people what is really the most important thing about education at the K-12 and secondary level. You know, the system has been built on amenity to produce, extended childhood for 18 to 20-year-olds. And I say this as a mom of college-age kids. We need to get back to the core of that and really reassess the value of the skills that are getting learned, because when they go to the private sector, it's very likely that a company will be able to test the skills that they've acquired in a half-hour iterative assessment, regardless of their credential.
Thank you, Anne. Any comments, David, on brick and mortar?
Yeah, I think that I agree with Anne. The sector is ripe for disruption. Right now, most of it, I have a college-age daughter as well, and I feel like I'm paying for the most overpriced streaming service in the world. We do things in a very expensive, very luxurious way, and it's just not a good value proposition for many. And there are many good things that will come from this disruption. Education has been had incredibly slow productivity growth because it's so labor intensive, and it doesn't need to be. And when it isn't, limited to the confines of small campuses that will never grow, more people can be served more effectively with greater convenience. Now, we don't have the secret sauce yet for making that as good as in person. But for some people, it's already better, like for working, parents who can't be in a classroom at a given time and each week and can do this remotely, that's better. So I think there's a lot to be gained here, but it certainly will change, maybe not at the elite universities. I expect people will still be willing to pay a lot of money to come to the Ivy Leagues, to come to MIT. But for a lot of other people, that's just not going to be sensible. And I don't think the state schools will even be able to, support it. So I worry about that elite and stratification component. But I think the overall movement towards more access at lower cost has got to be a good thing over the long run. And maybe there's a way to blend it appropriately, to use what in-person education is good for sparingly and do a lot of it other ways.
Well, that certainly would be a good outcome if we could get skills at a lower cost that will help produce better outcomes for low-wage workers. And there's a set of questions about silver linings that I want to address to you, Leigh, and back to you, David. Here they are. Are there any silver linings for low-wage skilled jobs that COVID has created? For example, Are there now jobs being created that are potentially accessible with some appropriate training opportunities? I think the question is going directly to your response, David, on training that is done less expensively. For example, more call center work being done remotely, telesitter, teletutor services, etc. Related question, is there a silver lining in the sudden switch to remote learning that may help with the effective instruction of teamwork, analytical, and other problem-solving skills? So these are, is there a telework training good outcome possible? Let me ask you, Leigh, what do you think? And then David to you, and if you wish to weigh in.
Yeah, I would say I think that change, I think lots of jobs. There were lots of more jobs, I think, in certain sector like in delivery. I think also some jobs that you just mentioned in other telework area. But in general, I would imagine some of these jobs I think are temporary, and also some of them I think they may generate I think fewer jobs than what I think in the past. I think without this kind of automation or new innovation, like in the retail, for example, if I would imagine, I think the e-commerce experience significant growth, and I would suspect that there will be new jobs, more jobs I think in newly created warehouse jobs or delivery jobs than the job losses I think in the stores. I think retail representatives and others. So this, and also I think for those people already lost their jobs, if they want to transit, I think, to these new jobs, I agree. I think they need some kind of adjustment, but I would imagine this one will not be too challenging. I think most of them are low-skill service jobs, but of course, that's not my area, job training. Probably David can talk more about that.
I mean, I do think there's a lot to be. There are a lot of upsides. We always are immediately focused on what we're losing and not what we're gaining. I actually think like already the movement to telepresence has huge benefits for people who do work with ideas and communicate with others for a living, but of course has huge disadvantages for people who do a lot of the physical in-person services. In the long run, I hope it'll allow, first of all, more work to be done telepresently in all kinds of activities, so call centers and support work, so some things obviously have to be delivered in person, but many of them don't. And actually, this partly depends on something we were talking about earlier, which is access to broadband. It is the case that many communities actually their economic viability depends upon whether they can have a high-speed internet or not, because otherwise people can't work there. And it's also the case, as probably many of you are aware, that cable companies fight very hard to prevent communities from setting up their own high-speed internet access services. They'd rather provide them low-speed service at monopolized prices. And they've passed laws in many states to prevent communities from setting up their own services. So I also think the movement to education online will be a very good thing. There's a lot of good things that will come from this technology. It's almost like discovering a fourth dimension where we can go somewhere without having to leave where we are. So that just can't be all bad. There's got to be great gains that come from that. But I think, as with many things, the beneficiaries tend to be the new adopters of the technology, and the people who bear the brunt of it are the ones whose old services or livelihoods are disrupted without a new alternative readily available. And unfortunately, in our situation, it's quite obvious that the people who are least harmed and probably most benefit are the people who are already at the part of the labor market, doing ideas, doing creative work, doing communication. And the people who are most adversely impacted, the people who are providing many of those physical services, and they are, of course, the less well-paid workers in our economy.
Yeah, Susan, I would add that I think that one silver lining to this disruption from the pandemic is an attention to, on an individual level and a societal level, an attention to wellness and mental health and care. The care economy, as Anne-Marie Slaughter has written about extensively, is so undervalued in our society. Women have been doing care work for centuries, unpaid. A growing industry is care of our elderly. And so I'm hoping that the silver lining of all this is that people really start to understand on a personal level the value of self-care, the value of mental health care and resiliency, and also see the value of the people we pay to take care of our loved ones, and that those wages go up and become higher quality jobs. I know that that's a future-proof career. You know, childcare workers, home healthcare aides, they're going to be in high demand for the foreseeable future. And also to David's point about retirement, we have a massive silver tsunami in the construction trades and other middle skills jobs. That is a short path to a middle class life with 18 months, 2 years of training where you can earn on the job. So I'm hoping there's a cultural shift that recognizes we need to build things. We need to get ready for climate change. We need to restore our infrastructure, and those jobs are in high demand, and you can train for them and make a good life.
Well, let's go to that question of training for such jobs and switch gears a bit because we've been talking about online training, although I do want to come back to the more general questions and ask a specific question. How can we use apprenticeship to secure more quality jobs? And let me just, that's the question. Other countries do a far better job. Germany does on this, and we do. And how can we do it better? And please, Lei and David weigh in as well. Starting with you, Anne.
Sure. So I think I was actually a teacher for several, almost 10 years at the public schools in Philadelphia and also at Mastery Charter School. And the emphasis since No Child Left Behind has been 100% on college. And that's a cultural thing that families, parents, educators in the K-12 system need to adjust that thinking and also understand that there's valuable work to be done, and maybe the prestige involved in a trade or a skills trade will increase, but at the very least, the opportunity would be recognized. There's a lot of challenge in talking about the role of unions and registered apprenticeship because they're not a monolith. There are unions that are using virtual reality in their apprenticeship training now as we speak, and there's other unions that are trying to pass laws to stop automation in its tracks. And so again, the Future Works Alliance is something that I imagine as essential for collaboration in the future to get to consensus about the best paths forward for the most people, and the ways also to communicate this cultural shift that we need to do.
Thank you, Anne. Lei, David, do you have any additional thoughts on apprenticeships?
I mean, apprenticeships have a lot of virtues. They've traditionally been done through labor unions, and labor unions are very atrophied at this point. And labor unions have not been enthusiastic about apprenticeships occurring outside of labor unions. This is something the White House has actually fought with the union sector about a lot, about creating what they call, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the term, sector-based training, which is certification for specific activities that doesn't run through the union sector. But the U.S. has a very complex and incomplete system for blue-collar vocational training relative to many other countries. We're not going to become Germany and have a centralized apprenticeships program. It's not going to happen. But we underinvest in skills training for people who don't go on to four-year colleges. We basically have a one-track system, which is high school is to send you to college. And if you fall off that track, well, God help you. And we could do much better there. And so creating more ports of entry in a better organized way so people knew what they were buying into, and more certifications to make sure that those credentials were meaningful would be valuable. A lot of people are focused on that problem. Right now it's a bit of the Wild West, but I'm hoping that we'll advance further in that direction, because I think there's real opportunity to help create skills, certification, and opportunity for people who are not going to do a four-year college degree and shouldn't be. And four-year college degree is certainly not necessary for everyone in our economy, and there can be many good jobs that don't require it. But it's also the case that most of the worst jobs are for those people without four-year degrees, and we need to get them in the right places.
That's very helpful. I want to come back to Philadelphia and building technology chains for future jobs. But there are a number of questions that move away from jobs to capital. And let me address this to both Lei and David. What role do you anticipate the elasticity of capital markets playing in the acceleration of automation? How does this differ across small and large businesses? To what extent or in what ways will the automation trend be impacted by political agendas to save jobs? That goes in a little different direction, but will capital markets support acceleration of automation? David?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think they will. The U.S. has very flexible capital markets. We have a big, the U.S. sort of venture sector and investment sector is the most robust in the world. And that's actually one of the strengths of the U.S. economy. Ironically, the two most innovative economies in the world are the U.S. and China. And both of them have lots and lots of investment potential. So yeah, I think that what capital investment depends on is an expectation of a reasonable rate of return. I think the political considerations we're talking about create a lot of uncertainty. And the Trump administration has roiled the waters in many ways and created uncertainty about what are viable businesses, where will manufacturing be, where will agriculture be. Now, part of this is part of a needed adjustment in the relationship between U.S. and the rest of the world, in terms of U.S. and China around intellectual property and many competitive areas. But I think that lack of stability creates uncertainty. But I guess a short answer to the question is yes. I think the U.S. capital markets will be willing to invest and have been willing to invest in many of these technologies if they see commercial potential. I don't think they're risk averse, in the way that traditional banks have been.
Lei and Ann, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I just definitely agree with what I think David just said. I just want to say that in the production function, just labor and the capital, and when labor is cheaper and the investment, I think there's not much restriction on using capital, I think, to replace labor. That will happen anyway, I think. And especially now, I think we have a low interest rate on capital that may provide, I think, promote, I think, further automation as well.
And on this, then I want to turn to your work in Philadelphia.
Well, just briefly about the question of capital. Artificial intelligence costs is very expensive right now, and it is going to be a divider, and it's going to eliminate a lot of small businesses. In the pandemic, for example, I had a Mexican store down the street that shut down for 6 weeks. Excellent Mexican food. Chipotle on Washington Avenue didn't miss a beat, moved to their app. They now have marketing data that they can churn through their algorithms, and they are going to better serve customers and more seamlessly deliver what they need to do. And this is the capital needed to implement the systems that Chipotle can do to eliminate competition on Main Street is, that is real. And in a pandemic crisis situation, capital doesn't have as much concern for their branding to eliminate jobs the way that they did before in flush times. So the question of branding is something we haven't talked about, but it's something that capital really cares about. Corporate protection of branding is essential, and it's slowed automation in some ways that now it's not slow because we're in a crisis.
Thank you, Ann. Now, we only have a few moments left, and I'm sorry to those whose questions I could not get to. Some of them are specific to speakers. Please send them emails. I'm sure they will be happy to respond to your specific questions that we did not get a chance to get to. But I do very much want to have a general discussion about regional efforts. In an earlier one of these series, we had Simon Johnson and Mark Moreau talk about the importance for overall productivity of the United States to have growth in second-tier marquee cities, of which hopefully Philadelphia will be one. So the question is, can you speak to regional efforts being made towards a solution to future-proof the workforce? For example, what is being done to increase the density of AI research, innovation, and more towards greater resilience and economic mobility? And I'm going to add, in Philadelphia. And another question, how might we assemble the collective expertise and action of Philadelphia to address major long-term issues? This is to you, Ann, but also David and Lei more generally. How do we strengthen regional economies? Ann?
Well, this is such a great question because I've been working on this for 2 years now to build. It was initially an internal City of Philadelphia project with a cross-department working group, and PIDC and the Fed was also well-versed. We were looking to create the Future Works Alliance, which after the project was disrupted by the pandemic, I decided to carry it out of government where actually it is better suited to convene regional actors. I mean, part of the problem is that politics and campaigning and the political culture has itself been disrupted by technology. We are in hyperpolarized times. Collaboration is harder. The dialogue is often driven by ideology, and the alliance is an attempt to remove problem solving from ideology and
And
put
I'm
the
going to
dialogue.
interrupt you right there because that seems like a wonderful place to end.
Okay.
It is now 1:14. Moving to dialogue and away from our corners is certainly something to be hoped for. I do want to give Ashley Putnam a chance to tell us what the Fed is doing on the for the future of workforce in this time of automation challenges. Anne?
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And yeah, I was like, Anne, Ashley, and actually what Anne is talking about is something that came out of an effort we started last year after Leigh's initial study on automation. There was some great concern in Philadelphia that automation impacts on work would mean increasing inequality in the region. And we saw how it disproportionately impacted communities of color, low-wage workers, people who were already in economically vulnerable positions. And so through that, we spent the past about year and a half bringing together regional stakeholders. We had a conference last November really asking how businesses could be involved. And one of the things we learned through that process is there was a need for an institutionalized partnership and for a group of people to continue to have this conversation, as well as to think innovatively about things like funding, right? What happens when public sector funding is going down? How are we going to invest in the skills needed for the future of work? We really need to create more iterative systems. So we were part of a pilot program that came together last year with Comcast and Philadelphia Works, some of whom are probably here on the call. But we're really excited to be looking ahead this year to thinking about a more equitable recovery for workers, right? We know historically that in recovery, people of color lag in both income and assets, and when they regain in recoveries, and that's happened in 2008. And honestly, looking at both David and Leigh's research, this is a very big concern for how automation is impacting our labor markets and our workers. And if we aren't thinking really intentionally about equity, we aren't going to get to equitable solutions. And so we're working on a strategy around an equitable workforce recovery. And we're going to be discussing that at an event we have coming up on October 2nd called A New Kind of Back to Work. There's a link there in the group chat, and we really encourage you to participate. But we're going to be talking both about the kinds of jobs that come back, how do we think about those job creation and economic development levers that Anne discussed, as well as some wraparound supports that are really critical. David mentioned the digital divide. This is so important, particularly in this current moment. People who do not have access to the internet or do not have the digital literacy to connect to jobs are really not faring well during this pandemic. And we're also going to talk about some things like childcare, right? Other wraparound supports that are really essential for people to be able to go back to work. And I think this moment in time is really helping us focus in on some of those things many people in the workforce development space have been talking about. So we hope you'll join us and stay tuned for some of the things we'll continue talking about on how to make our workforce recovery more equitable going forward.
Thank you, Ashley Putnam, for your work, and the Fed for your work on this and for this future upcoming event. Please be sure to register for that. And Anne, thank you so much for your work going forward. We look forward to what is going to come from that as an exemplar for the nation and as an important for our region. Leigh, as always, thank you for your good research and for being with us today. And David, thank you for your scholarship and contribution and for being with us today. And to the audience, thank you all. Please check in for future events that we will be doing together on this important research for equitable recovery as we attempt, for the sake of our nation, to use all of our talents. Thank you so much.